In the darkness of a still night, a black car cuts through the empty streets of the city. In the trunk, a wounded police officer struggles between groans and short breaths, trapped after a silent ambush. Unable to see the way, he pushes the metal walls, fumbling at every crack as if it were his last chance. Outside, the tires scrape on the asphalt and the engine drives away towards nothingness. In the kennel, a police dog suddenly wakes up, pacing the space with stiff steps. A neighboring lady observes the animal and decides to follow its direction, not knowing where it would lead. Inside the trunk, the policeman screams, but his voice is swallowed by the noise of the engine, until a headlight cuts through the darkness and the sound of claws on the ground announces an unpredictable presence. But what happens in that second? Nobody would be able to anticipate it. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thanks for joining us. Now, we return to our story. The night was silent, and the city seemed asleep under a blanket of deceptive tranquility. Officer Jake Morrison, accustomed to handling routine calls, believed he was facing just another ordinary incident, something that would be resolved quickly and leave no lasting marks. However, it took only a few minutes for that night to transform into something far more complex than he had ever imagined. What seemed like a simple verification on a deserted street in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, would soon reveal layers of deception that had been carefully planned for months. Jake had received the call just after midnight, a report of suspicious activity near the old industrial district where most of the warehouses had been abandoned for years. The dispatcher's voice had been calm, routine, giving him no reason to suspect that this call would be different from the hundreds of others he had responded to during his 15 years on the Phoenix Police Department. As he drove through the empty streets, Jake's mind wandered to his partner Rex, a German Shepherd who had been with the K9 unit for the past 5 years. Rex was currently resting at the department's K9 facility, and Jake found himself thinking about how the dog always seemed to sense when something was wrong, long before any human could detect it. Tonight, something felt different, but Jake couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The warehouse district loomed ahead, its darkened buildings casting long shadows under the sparse streetlights. Jake parked his patrol car near the entrance of the reported location, stepping out into the cool desert air. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the interstate and the occasional rustle of wind through the chain-link fences that surrounded the industrial complex. As he approached the designated warehouse, Jake noticed that the front door, which should have been secured, was slightly ajar. His training kicked in and he radioed his position to dispatch, following protocol even though everything appeared routine. What he didn't know was that his radio transmission had been intercepted by someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside the warehouse, the darkness was nearly complete. Jake's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing empty spaces where machinery had once operated. The beam caught movement in the far corner, and he called out, identifying himself as police. The response came not as words, but as the sound of footsteps moving quickly across the concrete floor, heading toward what appeared to be a back exit. Jake followed, his instincts telling him that this was more than just a vagrant seeking shelter. As he moved deeper into the warehouse, he began to notice details that suggested this place had been used recently. Fresh tire marks on the dusty floor, cigarette butts that weren't yet stale, and most tellingly, a stack of papers partially hidden behind an old filing cabinet. Meanwhile, several miles away at the Phoenix Police Department's K9 facility, Rex was displaying signs of unusual agitation. The German Shepherd, normally calm and disciplined during his off-duty hours, had begun pacing in his kennel, whining softly and pressing his nose against the chain-link door. His behavior was so unusual that it caught the attention of Margaret Chen, an elderly woman who lived in a small house adjacent to the facility. Margaret was 73 years old, a retired librarian who had moved to the neighborhood 5 years earlier to be closer to her daughter. She had always been fascinated by the police dogs and had developed an informal relationship with several of the handlers, who would occasionally let her observe training sessions. Her keen eye for detail, honed by decades of organizing information and helping people find what they needed, had made her particularly sensitive to changes in routine and behavior. On this particular night, Margaret had been unable to sleep, a common occurrence since her arthritis had been acting up. She had been sitting by her kitchen window, nursing a cup of chamomile tea, when she noticed Rex's unusual behavior. The dog's distress was evident even from a distance, and something in his actions reminded her of stories she had heard about animals sensing danger or disaster before humans could detect it. Back at the warehouse, Jake had discovered that the papers behind the filing cabinet were not random documents. They appeared to be copies of internal police reports, some dating back several years. His heart rate increased as he realized that these documents contained information that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the department. The implications were staggering, and he felt the first stirring of unease that went beyond the typical caution of responding to a call. As he photographed the documents with his phone, Jake heard the warehouse's main door slam shut. The sound echoed through the empty space like a gunshot, and when he tried to retrace his steps to the entrance, he found that the door would not budge. Someone had secured it from the outside, and the back exit he had been moving toward was similarly blocked. The realization that he had been deliberately led into this situation sent a chill through Jake that had nothing to do with the desert night air. Someone had wanted him to find these documents, but they also wanted to ensure that he couldn't simply walk away from what he had discovered. The setup was too elaborate to be coincidental, which meant that whoever was behind this had been planning it for some time. His radio crackled with static, but when he tried to call for backup, he found that the signal was being jammed. The warehouse, he realized, had been chosen specifically because it was in a dead zone for communications, a fact that someone would have had to research carefully. The level of preparation involved suggested that this was not the work of ordinary criminals, but something far more sophisticated and troubling. Rex's agitation had not gone unnoticed by Margaret, who decided that the dog's behavior warranted a closer look. She wrapped herself in a warm shawl and walked the short distance to the kennel facility, where she could see Rex more clearly. The German Shepherd was not just restless, he was focused, staring in a direction that Margaret realized led toward the industrial district, where she knew police officers sometimes responded to calls. The elderly woman had lived long enough to trust her instincts, and something about Rex's behavior reminded her of her late husband's stories from his time in the military. Animals, he had often told her, could sense things that humans missed, and their reactions were often the first warning of trouble. As she watched Rex continue his focused pacing, Margaret made a decision that would prove more significant than she could have imagined. She decided to follow the direction of the dog's attention, using her knowledge of the neighborhood and her natural curiosity to investigate what might be causing such distress in an animal known for his calm demeanor. Margaret Chen had always prided herself on her practical nature. But as she walked through the quiet streets toward the industrial district, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn by forces beyond her understanding. Rex's behavior had been so distinctly purposeful that it seemed almost as if the dog was trying to communicate something urgent. Her late husband, Thomas, had been a Navy veteran who often spoke about the importance of trusting instincts, both human and animal. Tonight, those lessons seemed more relevant than ever. The distance between the canine facility and the warehouse district was roughly 2 miles. Manageable for someone of Margaret's age who had maintained her walking routine despite her arthritis. As she made her way through the familiar neighborhoods, she found herself thinking about the police officers she had met over the years. Jake Morrison was among them, a dedicated man who always took time to speak with her when he visited Rex at the facility. There was something about his genuine care for his canine partner that had impressed her, and she hoped that wherever he was tonight, he was safe. Back at the warehouse, Jake was methodically exploring every possible exit, his police training taking over despite the unusual circumstances. The building was larger than it had appeared from the outside, with multiple rooms and corridors that suggested it had once housed a significant manufacturing operation. As he moved through the space, he continued to find evidence that someone had been using the facility recently, but not for any legitimate business purpose. In what appeared to have been the former office area, Jake discovered a desk with more documents scattered across its surface. These papers were different from the ones he had found earlier. They contained detailed information about police patrol schedules, shift changes, and communication protocols. The level of detail was disturbing, suggesting that whoever had compiled this information had access to internal department systems or was working with someone who did. The realization that there might be corruption within his own department hit Jake like a physical blow. He had always believed in the integrity of the Phoenix Police Department, had built his career on the assumption that he was working alongside people who shared his commitment to justice and public service. The possibility that someone he worked with, someone he trusted, might be involved in whatever conspiracy had led him to this warehouse was almost too difficult to accept. As he photographed the additional documents, Jake noticed that several of the patrol schedules had specific routes highlighted in red ink. His own patrol area was among those marked, and he realized that his presence at the warehouse tonight had not been coincidental. Someone had known exactly where he would be and when, which meant that his movements had been monitored and predicted with uncomfortable precision. Rex's restlessness had evolved into something more focused and determined. The German Shepherd had begun moving back and forth along the fence line of the kennel facility, following a pattern that seemed to correspond with the direction Margaret had walked. Other dogs in the facility had begun to respond to Rex's agitation, creating a chorus of whines and barks that would normally have brought facility staff running. However, the skeleton crew that worked the night shift was dealing with a computer system malfunction that required their complete attention, leaving the dogs' distress unnoticed. Margaret had reached the outskirts of the industrial district and was surprised to find that her 73-year-old legs had carried her this far without significant discomfort. The adrenaline of following her instincts seemed to have temporarily overcome her arthritis, and she felt more energized than she had in months. As she approached the area where she believed Rex's attention had been focused, she noticed that one of the warehouses showed signs of recent activity. The building that caught her attention was partially illuminated by a security light that cast long shadows across the parking area. Margaret could see tire tracks in the dust, and more importantly, she recognized the distinctive markings of a police patrol car. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized that her intuition about Rex's behavior might have been correct. Somewhere in or around this warehouse, there might be a police officer who needed help. Meanwhile, Jake had discovered that the warehouse's interior was more complex than he had initially realized. What he had taken for a simple storage facility actually contained a network of smaller rooms and offices, some of which showed clear evidence of recent occupation. In one room, he found a sophisticated communication setup that included radio equipment capable of monitoring and jamming police frequencies. The discovery confirmed his growing suspicion that he had walked into a carefully planned trap. The equipment in the communication room was not something that could be assembled overnight. The level of preparation and investment suggested that whatever operation was being conducted from this warehouse had been in development for months, possibly years. Jake began to understand that his discovery of the documents had not been accidental. He had been led here deliberately. But the question remained whether he was meant to find the evidence or become part of a larger cover-up. As he examined the radio equipment more closely, Jake found a logbook that contained entries spanning the past 6 months. The entries documented police communications, patrol schedules, and incident reports, all recorded with the kind of detail that suggested someone was building a comprehensive intelligence file on department operations. The implications were staggering, and Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that what he had stumbled upon could potentially compromise the safety and effectiveness of every officer in the Phoenix Police Department. Margaret had found a position where she could observe the warehouse without being easily detected. Her years of experience as a librarian had taught her the value of patient observation and careful documentation, skills that proved surprisingly relevant to her current situation. She had taken note of the patrol car's license plate number and was trying to remember if she had seen this particular vehicle during Jake Morrison's visits to the canine facility. The elderly woman's practical nature asserted itself as she considered her options. She could return home and call the police. But if Officer Morrison was inside the warehouse and potentially in trouble, the time it would take for backup to arrive might be crucial. Alternatively, she could try to get closer and determine whether assistance was actually needed, though she recognized that her age and physical limitations made this a risky proposition. As Margaret debated her next move, she noticed that the warehouse had multiple entrances, some of which appeared to be less secure than others. Her husband had taught her to think strategically during his military career, and she found herself applying those lessons as she assessed the situation. If there was indeed a police officer inside who needed help, she might be able to provide assistance, or at least confirm that backup was required. Rex's behavior at the canine facility had become so pronounced that it finally attracted the attention of Officer David Park, a younger officer who was completing paperwork in the administrative building adjacent to the kennels. David had worked with Rex and Jake on several occasions and recognized that the German Shepherd's distress was unusual and potentially significant. The young officer's concern deepened when he realized that Jake had not checked in with dispatch for over an hour, an unusual lapse for someone known for his adherence to protocol. David tried to raise Jake on the radio, but received no response, which prompted him to check the patrol schedule and determine Jake's last known location. The warehouse district had a reputation for communication dead spots, but Jake's failure to respond was still concerning enough to warrant investigation. As these various threads began to converge, none of the participants fully understood how their individual actions were becoming part of a larger pattern that would ultimately determine not only Jake Morrison's fate, but also the exposure of a conspiracy that reached deeper into the Phoenix Police Department than anyone had imagined. Officer David Park's concern had escalated beyond routine worry as he reviewed Jake Morrison's patrol log and compared it with the GPS tracking data from his patrol vehicle. The last recorded position showed Jake's car stationary in the warehouse district for over 90 minutes, an unusually long time for a routine call. David's training told him that protocol required him to notify his supervisor, but his instincts suggested that time might be of critical importance. As David prepared to drive to Jake's last known location, he made a decision that would prove pivotal. Rather than following standard procedure and waiting for supervisory approval, he decided to respond immediately to what his gut told him was an emergency situation. His experience with Rex had taught him to trust the instincts of both animals and seasoned officers, and Jake Morrison's failure to maintain communication was completely out of character. The drive to the warehouse district took David through parts of Phoenix that were unfamiliar to him, as his usual patrol area covered the downtown core and residential neighborhoods. As he navigated the increasingly industrial landscape, he found himself thinking about the various stories he had heard about this particular area. Several officers had mentioned experiencing communication problems here, attributing them to interference from old industrial equipment. But David was beginning to wonder if there might be more deliberate explanations. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen had positioned herself behind a concrete barrier where she could observe the warehouse entrance while remaining concealed. Her years of experience observing human behavior from her position at the library reference desk had taught her to notice details that others might miss, and she was applying those skills to her current surveillance. The patrol car had not moved since her arrival, and she had seen no signs of activity around the building's main entrance. However, Margaret's attention was drawn to a side entrance that showed signs of recent use. The door appeared to be slightly ajar, and she could see that the area around it had been disturbed, with footprints visible in the dust. Her practical mind began to work through the possibilities, and she realized that if Officer Morrison was indeed inside the building, he might have entered through this secondary access point. Inside the warehouse, Jake had made a discovery that fundamentally changed his understanding of the situation. In a back office that appeared to have been converted into a command center, he found a sophisticated monitoring setup that included multiple computer screens displaying what appeared to be real-time feeds from various locations throughout Phoenix. The technology was far more advanced than anything he had expected to find in an abandoned warehouse, suggesting that whoever was operating this facility had significant financial resources and technical expertise. More disturbing than the equipment itself were the locations being monitored. Jake recognized several of the feeds as showing the Phoenix Police Department's parking garage, the entrance to the K9 facility, and various strategic points throughout the city. The implications were staggering, as this level of surveillance suggested that someone was conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering on police operations and personnel. As Jake documented the monitoring setup with his phone camera, he discovered a series of files on one of the computers that contained detailed profiles of various police officers, including himself. The file bearing his name contained not only his official personnel record, but also personal information that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the department's Human Resources Division. The profile included details about his partnership with Rex, his patrol schedules, and even information about his personal relationships and financial situation. The revelation that he had been under surveillance for an extended period was deeply unsettling, but it also provided Jake with crucial insight into how his presence at the warehouse had been orchestrated. Someone with access to this level of information would have been able to predict his movements and manipulate circumstances to ensure that he would respond to a call in this specific location. The question that remained was whether his discovery of this operation had been intentional or if he had stumbled upon something that was meant to remain hidden. Rex's behavior at the K9 facility had reached a crescendo of agitation that finally overcame the technical problems that had been distracting the night shift staff. Sergeant Linda Rodriguez, a veteran handler with over 20 years of experience working with police dogs, recognized that Rex's distress was unlike anything she had seen from the normally disciplined German Shepherd. Her immediate concern was that Rex might be experiencing a medical emergency, but as she approached his kennel, she realized that his agitation was focused and purposeful rather than indicative of illness or injury. Sergeant Rodriguez had worked with enough police dogs to understand that their behavior often reflected instincts that humans had lost or learned to ignore. Rex's intense focus in the direction of the warehouse district, combined with his obvious distress, suggested that he was responding to a situation involving his partner. The sergeant's experience told her that this was not a false alarm. and she immediately began trying to contact Jake Morrison through official channels. When her attempts to reach Jake through normal communication proved unsuccessful, Sergeant Rodriguez made the decision to drive to his last known location herself. Her years of experience had taught her to trust the instincts of police dogs, and Rex's behavior was too pronounced to ignore. As she prepared to leave the facility, she noticed an elderly woman near the perimeter fence who appeared to be observing the kennels with unusual interest. Margaret Chen had returned to the canine facility after her reconnaissance of the warehouse. Driven by a growing certainty that the police officer inside the building needed assistance, but unsure of how to provide it. Her observation of Rex's continued agitation confirmed her belief that the dog was responding to his partner's distress, and she realized that the police personnel at the facility might be unaware of the situation developing in the warehouse district. When Sergeant Rodriguez approached Margaret, the elderly woman quickly explained her observations and her concerns about Officer Morrison's welfare. The sergeant's initial skepticism gave way to serious attention as Margaret provided specific details about the warehouse, the patrol car's location, and the evidence of recent activity she had observed. The combination of Rex's behavior and Margaret's detailed account convinced Sergeant Rodriguez that immediate action was required. Officer David Park had arrived at the warehouse district and quickly located Jake's patrol car. The vehicle was unlocked and showed no signs of disturbance, but Jake's absence and the failure of his radio to respond to repeated calls confirmed David's fears that something was seriously wrong. As he examined the area around the patrol car, David noticed the same signs that had caught Margaret's attention. Footprints leading toward the warehouse and evidence that the building had been accessed recently. David's training told him to wait for backup before entering the warehouse, but his concern for Jake's safety overrode his adherence to protocol. As he approached the building's main entrance, he discovered that it was secured from the inside, confirming his suspicion that Jake might be trapped within the structure. The realization that his colleague might be in immediate danger prompted David to begin searching for alternative ways to enter the building. As David circled the warehouse perimeter, he encountered Margaret Chen, who had returned to continue her observation of the situation. The elderly woman's presence at what appeared to be a police emergency initially surprised David. But Margaret's clear explanation of how she had come to be involved and her detailed knowledge of the situation quickly convinced him that she might be a valuable ally rather than an obstacle. The convergence of these various concerned parties around the warehouse created an unexpected network of individuals who were each responding to different aspects of the same crisis. Rex's instinctive connection to his partner had set events in motion. Margaret's observational skills and willingness to act had provided crucial intelligence. David's concern for a colleague had brought official police resources to bear, and Sergeant Rodriguez's experience with police dogs had validated the urgency of the situation. Inside the warehouse, Jake had continued his exploration and made additional discoveries that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the operation being conducted from this facility. Among the documents and electronic files, he found evidence of a systematic effort to gather intelligence on police operations that went far beyond simple surveillance. The scope of the information collected suggested that someone was building a comprehensive understanding of how the Phoenix Police Department functioned, possibly with the goal of exploiting weaknesses or predicting responses to various scenarios. The realization that he had stumbled upon what appeared to be a long-term intelligence operation targeting his own department filled Jake with a mixture of anger and determination. Whatever the ultimate purpose of this surveillance might be, he knew that his discovery of it could not be allowed to go unreported, regardless of the personal risk involved. The alliance between David Park and Margaret Chen had formed naturally as they shared information about their respective observations and concerns. Margaret's detailed account of Rex's behavior and her reconnaissance of the warehouse provided David with valuable intelligence, while his official authority and training gave her the confidence that appropriate action would be taken to help Officer Morrison. Together, they began developing a plan to safely extract Jake from what they now understood to be a complex and potentially dangerous situation. Sergeant Rodriguez arrived at the warehouse just as David and Margaret were completing their assessment of the building's perimeter. The convergence of three concerned individuals, each driven by different but complementary motivations, created an unexpected but effective team. Rodriguez's experience with tactical situations, David's knowledge of current police procedures, and Margaret's observational skills combined to form a comprehensive understanding of the challenges they faced. As the three discussed their options, they were interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the warehouse complex. Two black SUVs entered the parking area and positioned themselves near Jake's patrol car, immediately raising the stakes of an already tense situation. The occupants of the vehicles were dressed in civilian clothes, but moved with the coordination and discipline that suggested either law enforcement or security backgrounds. Margaret, David, and Sergeant Rodriguez quickly concealed themselves behind a concrete barrier where they could observe the new arrivals without being detected. The elderly woman's experience with observation and the two officers' training in surveillance techniques allowed them to gather crucial information about the newcomers without exposing themselves to potential danger. The leader of the group that emerged from the SUVs was a man in his 40s with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. He spoke briefly with his companions before directing them to take positions around the warehouse perimeter. The efficiency of their deployment suggested that this was not their first visit to this location, and that they were familiar with the building's layout and security considerations. Inside the warehouse, Jake had heard the arrival of the vehicles and realized that his situation had become significantly more complicated. The monitoring equipment had allowed him to observe the parking area through external security cameras, and he could see that the new arrivals were positioning themselves in a way that would make any attempt to leave the building extremely difficult. The coordinated nature of their arrival suggested that his presence in the warehouse had been expected, and that this confrontation had been planned in advance. As Jake watched the deployment of personnel around the building, he noticed something that caused his heart to sink. Among the group of newcomers, he recognized Detective Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a supervisor from his own department whom he had worked with on several occasions. Hayes was a respected member of the Phoenix Police Department with over 20 years of service and a reputation for integrity and competence. His presence with this group suggested that the conspiracy Jake had uncovered reached higher into the department hierarchy than he had feared. The recognition of Lieutenant Hayes forced Jake to confront the devastating possibility that the corruption he had discovered was not limited to lower-level personnel, but might involve supervisory staff who had access to sensitive information and decision-making authority. The implications were staggering, as it meant that the intelligence operation being conducted from the warehouse might have official sanction or protection from within the department itself. Lieutenant Hayes entered the warehouse accompanied by two other individuals, and Jake could hear their voices carrying through the empty spaces of the building. Rather than attempting to hide, Jake made the strategic decision to reveal himself and confront the situation directly. His years of police experience had taught him that sometimes the best defense was to take the initiative and force his opponents to react to his actions rather than allowing them to control the narrative. "Lieutenant Hayes!" Jake called out as he emerged from the office area where he had been examining the monitoring equipment. "I think we need to talk about what's going on here." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced in his law enforcement career. Rather than expressing surprise at finding Jake in the warehouse, Lieutenant Hayes seemed relieved, as if Jake's presence had been both expected and desired. The lieutenant's explanation of the situation was complex and disturbing, revealing layers of bureaucratic corruption and political pressure that Jake had never suspected existed within the Phoenix Police Department. According to Hayes, the monitoring operation in the warehouse was part of an internal investigation into suspected corruption among certain department personnel. The intelligence gathering that Jake had discovered was being conducted with the knowledge and approval of federal authorities who were investigating allegations of misconduct that reached into multiple levels of the department hierarchy. Jake's discovery of the operation had not been accidental. He had been deliberately led to the warehouse as part of a test of his integrity and potential value as an ally in the investigation. The revelation that he had been under evaluation without his knowledge was deeply unsettling to Jake, but Hayes explained that the federal investigation required absolute secrecy and that even innocent officers could not be informed of its existence without risking the exposure of the entire operation. The monitoring of Jake's activities and the detailed profiles that had been compiled were part of an effort to identify trustworthy personnel who could be safely brought into the investigation when the time was appropriate. Hayes revealed that the corruption being investigated involved the systematic manipulation of police resources for personal gain, including the alteration of incident reports, the protection of certain criminal activities, and the misuse of department equipment and personnel. The scope of the misconduct was extensive enough to require federal intervention, and the investigation had been ongoing for over 2 years without the knowledge of most department personnel. Outside the warehouse, Margaret, David, and Sergeant Rodriguez had observed the entry of Lieutenant Hayes and his companions with growing concern. The presence of what appeared to be high-ranking law enforcement personnel complicated their understanding of the situation and raised questions about whether their intervention might actually be interfering with legitimate police operations. However, their concern for Jake's welfare remained paramount, and they continued to monitor the situation while debating their next course of action. Sergeant Rodriguez's experience with complex police operations led her to suggest that they might be witnessing an undercover investigation or internal affairs operation that would explain the unusual circumstances surrounding Jake's presence in the warehouse. David's knowledge of department procedures supported this possibility, but Margaret's observations of the careful planning and surveillance that had preceded these events suggested that the situation might be more complex than a standard investigation. The elderly woman's practical wisdom asserted itself as she pointed out that regardless of the official nature of the operation, Jake Morrison remained isolated in a potentially dangerous situation without backup or communication with the outside world. Her concern was not with the bureaucratic or legal implications of the situation, but with the immediate welfare of a police officer who might need assistance. Inside the warehouse, Jake was struggling to process the implications of Lieutenant Hayes' revelations. The explanation of a federal investigation provided context for many of the things he had observed, but it also raised new questions about trust, loyalty, and the nature of the institution he had served for 15 years. The realization that his own department had been compromised to the extent that federal intervention was required was profoundly disturbing and forced him to reconsider many of his assumptions about his colleagues and supervisors. Hayes offered Jake the opportunity to become an active participant in the federal investigation, explaining that his reputation for integrity and his access to patrol-level intelligence made him a valuable potential asset. The lieutenant emphasized that Jake's cooperation would be voluntary and that he could choose to return to his regular duties with no negative consequences if he preferred not to become involved in the investigation. The weight of the decision was enormous. as Jake realized that accepting Hayes' offer would fundamentally change his relationship with the Phoenix Police Department and potentially put him at odds with colleagues he had worked alongside for years. However, the evidence he had seen in the warehouse convinced him that the corruption being investigated was real and serious enough to require his involvement, regardless of the personal cost. As Jake considered his response to Lieutenant Hayes' offer, he found himself thinking about Rex and the bond of loyalty and trust that existed between them. The German Shepherd's instinctive response to his partner's distress had set in motion a chain of events that had brought multiple concerned individuals to the warehouse, demonstrating the power of genuine care and commitment even in the face of complex and dangerous circumstances. Jake's decision to join the federal investigation came after several minutes of intense consideration, during which he weighed his loyalty to the Phoenix Police Department against his commitment to justice and integrity. The evidence he had seen in the warehouse, combined with Lieutenant Hayes' detailed explanation of the corruption that had been uncovered, convinced him that his participation was not only necessary but morally imperative. However, accepting this role meant that he would be operating under deep cover within his own department, a prospect that filled him with both determination and apprehension. Lieutenant Hayes explained that Jake's first assignment would be to return to his regular patrol duties while maintaining careful observation of specific individuals who were suspected of involvement in the corruption scheme. The federal agents had identified several patterns of behavior that suggested certain officers were using their positions to provide information and protection to individuals engaged in activities that, while not necessarily violent, were undermining the integrity of law enforcement operations throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. The sophisticated monitoring operation that Jake had discovered in the warehouse was just one component of a much larger investigation that included financial audits, communication intercepts, and surveillance of suspected corrupt officers. The federal authorities had been building their case methodically, but they needed someone with Jake's access and reputation to gather the final pieces of evidence required to support prosecution and departmental reform. As Hayes briefed Jake on the operational details of his new role, both men were unaware that the situation outside the warehouse was developing in ways that would significantly complicate their carefully planned investigation. Margaret Chen, David Park, and Sergeant Rodriguez had grown increasingly concerned about the length of time that Jake had been inside the building, and their worry had evolved into a determination to take action regardless of the potential consequences. Margaret's practical wisdom had led her to suggest that they needed to find a way to confirm Jake's safety without interfering with what might be legitimate police operations. Her years of experience in solving complex research problems had taught her to approach challenges systematically, and she proposed that they attempt to establish communication with Jake before taking any more dramatic action. Sergeant Rodriguez had brought a portable radio from her patrol vehicle, and she began attempting to contact Jake through various communication channels, while David used his cell phone to try reaching him directly. Their efforts were complicated by the communication jamming equipment that was still operating within the warehouse. But Rodriguez's familiarity with police radio protocols allowed her to find frequencies that were not being blocked. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez managed to establish a weak connection with Jake's radio, allowing for brief and fragmented communication. Jake's voice, though distorted by interference, was clear enough to convey that he was safe but involved in a complex situation that he could not fully explain over an unsecured channel. The relief that Margaret, David, and Rodriguez felt at hearing Jake's voice was tempered by their realization that the situation was far from resolved. Inside the warehouse, Jake heard the radio contact from his colleagues and realized that their concern had brought them to the warehouse despite the potential danger. Lieutenant Hayes was initially alarmed by the presence of unauthorized personnel near the investigation site. But Jake's explanation of how Rex's behavior had initiated the chain of events leading to their arrival helped the lieutenant understand that the intervention had been motivated by genuine concern rather than any attempt to interfere with official operations. The presence of Margaret, David, and Rodriguez outside the warehouse created both an opportunity and a challenge for the federal investigation. Their concern for Jake demonstrated the kind of loyalty and integrity that the investigation was trying to protect, but their involvement also risked exposing the operation to individuals who had not been cleared for knowledge of its existence. After careful consideration, Lieutenant Hayes made the decision to bring the three concerned individuals into the warehouse for a limited briefing on the situation. This decision was unprecedented in the investigation and required immediate consultation with federal supervisors. But Hayes recognized that the alternative of leaving them outside with incomplete information posed greater risks to the operation's security. The reunion between Jake and his concerned colleagues was emotional, particularly when Sergeant Rodriguez explained how Rex's behavior had initiated the entire sequence of events that had led them to the warehouse. The German Shepherd's instinctive response to his partner's distress had demonstrated the profound bond that existed between them, and had indirectly contributed to exposing Jake to an opportunity to make a significant contribution to cleaning up corruption within his department. Margaret Chen's role in the evening's events was particularly remarkable, as her decision to follow her instincts and Rex's apparent guidance had provided crucial intelligence and coordination that had brought together the various individuals who were now working to support Jake and the federal investigation. Her practical approach to problem solving and her willingness to take action despite her age and physical limitations had demonstrated that courage and commitment could emerge from unexpected sources. David Park's quick response to his concerns about Jake's safety had provided additional law enforcement resources at a critical moment, and his willingness to take initiative rather than waiting for official authorization had potentially prevented the situation from escalating in dangerous directions. His actions demonstrated the kind of proactive thinking and colleague loyalty that the federal investigation was trying to preserve within the Phoenix Police Department. Lieutenant Hayes' briefing of the three newcomers was necessarily limited, but he provided enough information to help them understand the legitimate nature of the investigation and the importance of maintaining confidentiality about what they had learned. The federal operation depended on absolute secrecy, and any premature disclosure could compromise years of careful work and potentially allow corrupt individuals to escape accountability. As the group discussed the implications of the investigation and Jake's new role within it, they were interrupted by an alert from the monitoring equipment indicating that additional vehicles were approaching the warehouse complex. The arrival of more personnel suggested that the situation was entering a new phase, and Lieutenant Hayes quickly moved to determine whether the newcomers were part of the federal operation or represented a potential threat to the investigation. The vehicles that entered the parking area were unmarked sedans that contained what appeared to be federal agents based on their professional appearance and coordinated movements. However, Lieutenant Hayes' attempt to verify their identity through official channels revealed a disturbing discrepancy. The agents who were approaching the warehouse were not part of the authorized federal investigation team, and their presence suggested that the operation might have been compromised. The realization that unauthorized federal personnel were taking an interest in the warehouse investigation created an entirely new level of complexity and danger. If the operation had been exposed to individuals who were not part of the legitimate investigation, it might mean that the corruption within the Phoenix Police Department had connections that reached into federal agencies as well. The implications were staggering and suggested that the scope of the misconduct might be far broader than anyone had imagined. Jake's training and experience kicked in as he realized that the situation had evolved beyond a simple internal investigation into something that potentially threatened the safety of everyone in the warehouse. The arrival of unauthorized federal agents suggested that powerful interests were involved in the corruption scheme, and that exposure of the investigation posed risks that went beyond departmental discipline or prosecution. Lieutenant Hayes began implementing emergency protocols designed to protect the integrity of the investigation and the safety of personnel involved in it. The warehouse's communication equipment was used to contact legitimate federal supervisors and request immediate backup and security support. However, the response to these requests revealed another disturbing development. The official federal investigation had been suspended earlier that evening due to concerns about security breaches and potential compromise of the operation. The suspension of the official investigation meant that Lieutenant Hayes and his team were operating without current authorization, and their presence at the warehouse could be interpreted as unauthorized activity rather than legitimate law enforcement operations. The complexity of the bureaucratic and legal implications was overwhelming, but the immediate concern was the safety of Jake, Margaret, David, Rodriguez, and the other personnel who had become involved in the situation. As the unauthorized federal agents positioned themselves around the warehouse, it became clear that a confrontation was inevitable. The question was whether this confrontation would involve legitimate law enforcement personnel acting on accurate information, or whether it represented an attempt by corrupt interests to suppress the investigation and eliminate potential witnesses to misconduct that reached far beyond the Phoenix Police Department. The tension in the warehouse reached its peak as the unauthorized federal agents began attempting to gain entry to the building. Lieutenant Hayes had secured all access points and was coordinating with legitimate federal supervisors who were racing to the scene to clarify the situation and provide protection for the personnel inside. The complexity of the bureaucratic confusion was matched only by the danger it created for everyone involved in what had begun as a routine patrol call and evolved into something far more significant. Jake Morrison found himself at the center of a situation that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. His decision to trust Lieutenant Hayes and join the federal investigation had placed him in a position where he was simultaneously a Phoenix Police Department officer, a federal investigation asset, and a potential target of corrupt interests that apparently reached beyond local law enforcement. The weight of these multiple roles was enormous, but his commitment to justice and integrity provided him with the clarity he needed to navigate the complex challenges ahead. The breakthrough that resolved the immediate crisis came from an unexpected source: Margaret Chen, whose practical wisdom and observational skills had been instrumental throughout the evening's events. Noticed something that the trained law enforcement personnel had missed. While monitoring the external cameras, she observed that one of the unauthorized federal agents was using hand signals and communication patterns that seemed familiar from her late husband's descriptions of military operations. Margaret's observation led to a crucial realization. The unauthorized agents were not federal law enforcement personnel at all, but private security contractors who had been hired to monitor and potentially disrupt the legitimate federal investigation. This discovery explained the bureaucratic confusion surrounding their presence and provided a clear framework for understanding the threat they represented. Lieutenant Hayes immediately contacted his legitimate federal supervisors with this new information, and within minutes, genuine federal agents arrived at the warehouse complex to confront the private security contractors. The confrontation was brief and professional. As the contractors realized that their cover had been exposed and that continuing their mission would result in serious legal consequences for their employers. The resolution of the immediate security threat allowed Jake and his colleagues to focus on the larger implications of what they had discovered. The federal investigation into Phoenix Police Department corruption was legitimate and ongoing, but it had been complicated by the involvement of private interests who were attempting to protect their own investments in the corrupt activities that were being investigated. The revelation that emerged from the subsequent federal briefing was both disturbing and enlightening. The corruption within the Phoenix Police Department was part of a larger network that included political figures, business leaders, and private security companies who had been working together to manipulate law enforcement resources for financial gain. The scope of the conspiracy was much broader than anyone had initially suspected, but it was also more vulnerable to exposure than the participants had realized. Jake's role in the investigation became even more crucial, as federal agents explained that his access to patrol-level information and his reputation for integrity made him uniquely positioned to gather evidence against the remaining corrupt personnel within the department. The monitoring operation in the warehouse had been just one component of a comprehensive effort to document and prosecute misconduct that had been undermining public safety and justice throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. The involvement of Margaret Chen, David Park, and Sergeant Rodriguez in the evening's events had created an unexpected but valuable expansion of the investigation's resources. Margaret's observational skills and practical wisdom had proven instrumental in identifying threats and solving problems, while David's initiative and Rodriguez's experience with police operations had provided crucial support at critical moments. Rex's role in initiating the entire sequence of events was recognized as remarkable, even by federal agents who had extensive experience with police dogs. The German Shepherd's instinctive response to his partner's distress had demonstrated the profound bond that existed between them and had indirectly contributed to exposing a conspiracy that might otherwise have remained hidden for months or years longer. As the immediate crisis was resolved and the various participants began to understand their roles in the ongoing investigation, Lieutenant Hayes provided a comprehensive briefing on what would happen next. The federal investigation would continue with enhanced security measures and a broader scope that reflected the new understanding of the conspiracy's reach. Jake would return to his patrol duties with specific assignments to gather additional evidence, while maintaining the appearance of normal operations to avoid alerting remaining corrupt personnel. The private security contractors who had been attempting to disrupt the investigation were taken into custody for questioning, and their employers would face federal charges related to obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The exposure of this private involvement had actually strengthened the federal case by providing concrete evidence of the financial interests that were motivating the corruption within the Phoenix Police Department. Margaret Chen's unexpected contribution to a federal law enforcement investigation would normally have remained classified, but her role was so significant that federal supervisors made the unusual decision to formally recognize her assistance. The elderly woman's willingness to follow her instincts and take action, despite the potential risks, had potentially saved lives and certainly had protected the integrity of an important investigation. David Park's proactive response to his concerns about a colleague had demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and loyalty that effective law enforcement required. His actions had brought additional resources to bear at a crucial moment and had helped prevent the situation from escalating in dangerous directions. The federal investigation team noted his performance for potential future consideration in specialized assignments. Sergeant Rodriguez's experience and quick thinking had provided crucial coordination and communication support throughout the crisis. Her ability to establish radio contact with Jake, despite the communication jamming, had been instrumental in resolving the situation peacefully, and her knowledge of police dog behavior had helped validate the significance of Rex's distress signals. The resolution of the warehouse incident marked the beginning of a new phase in the federal investigation, but it also represented a personal transformation for Jake Morrison. His willingness to confront corruption within his own department, even at considerable personal risk, had demonstrated a level of integrity and courage that would serve him well in his new role as an undercover federal asset. The bond between Jake and Rex had been tested and proven stronger than ever through the evening's events. The German Shepherd's instinctive loyalty and his ability to sense his partner's distress had initiated a chain of events that had ultimately protected both of them and had contributed to exposing a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of law enforcement throughout Phoenix. As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, the various participants in the warehouse incident began to return to their regular lives, but with the knowledge that they had all played important roles in something much larger than themselves. The federal investigation would continue for months, but the foundation for its success had been laid through the unexpected cooperation of individuals who had been brought together by circumstance and united by their commitment to justice and integrity. Margaret Chen returned to her small house near the canine facility with a sense of satisfaction that she had not experienced since her retirement from the library. Her practical skills and willingness to act on her instincts had made a real difference in protecting a police officer and exposing corruption that threatened public safety. She would continue to watch over the police dogs with renewed appreciation for their important role in law enforcement. Jake Morrison resumed his patrol duties with Rex, but now with the additional responsibility of gathering intelligence for the federal investigation. The experience in the warehouse had deepened his understanding of both the challenges and the importance of maintaining integrity within law enforcement, and he was committed to seeing the investigation through to its conclusion regardless of the personal cost. The federal investigation ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 17 individuals, including 3 Phoenix Police Department supervisors, 2 city council members, and several business leaders who had been involved in the corruption conspiracy. The scope of the misconduct was even broader than the initial investigation had suspected. But the evidence gathered through Jake's undercover work and the cooperation of other honest law enforcement personnel was sufficient to support successful prosecutions and significant reforms within the department. Rex received special recognition from the Phoenix Police Department for his role in initiating the investigation, and his story became part of the training curriculum for new police dog handlers throughout Arizona. The bond between police dogs and their human partners was already well understood within law enforcement, but Rex's response to Jake's distress provided a compelling example of how that bond could contribute to protecting both officers and the integrity of their mission. The warehouse that had served as the focal point for the evening's dramatic events was eventually converted into a training facility for federal law enforcement agencies, serving as a reminder that corruption and conspiracy could be defeated through the coordinated efforts of honest individuals who were willing to take risks to protect justice and public safety. Dear viewers, we hope that Jake and Rex's story has moved you deeply, showing how loyalty, courage, and unexpected alliances can triumph over corruption and adversity. This tale of trust between a police officer and his canine partner, supported by the wisdom of an elderly woman and the dedication of fellow officers, reminds us that heroes come in all forms and that integrity always finds a way to prevail. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. We bring you unique stories every day that explore the complexity of human relationships and the power of doing what's right. Don't miss our upcoming content. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these inspiring tales of courage and hope.